This is the record. This is the third part of chapter 1 of Powernomics. I'm gonna just go ahead and continue reading. Just a few pages left. Media monopolies. Commercial media create a virtual reality of our society. Not only are the owners of media responsible for the information that we see and hear, but they create images of blacks that define us and our sense of community. This is troublesome for blacks because whites hold ownership monopolies over this nation's print and electronic media. Media ownership is a source of control over power, wealth, and information. Media power is political power. Whites control nearly 100% of this nation's 1,500 daily newspapers, 11,000 radio stations, 11,800 cable systems, 1,500 television stations, and the major internet businesses. These monopolies ensure that blacks will never have an effective mass communication system of their own. It means that blacks will always have to ask permission to use white-owned mass communication vehicles to reach out to other blacks or discuss sensitive racial issues. Members of the public who desire to be exposed to the perspective of blacks are deprived of that information and do not have access to that type of unfiltered programming. White society constructs monopolies inside of monopolies. Clear channel communications provides a good example of media ownership as an important racial monopoly that is also a major source of wealth and power. According to the company's 1999 annual report, it owns 900 radio stations, 19 television stations, and 700,000 outdoor advertising units in the United States. It has equity interest in 240 radio stations internationally. The company gross revenue in 99 was $3 billion, which was up 97% from 1998, a year prior. White media protects white interests. Without wealth to own media outlets, blacks will always be in position of complaining about the images others present of them, but they will never have sufficient means to change or fashion appropriate images of themselves. In 1999, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, led a complaint and threatened a boycott against all the networks for a television season that lacked minority characters in the program lineup. The network owners did not forget that blacks existed, they chose not to include them. In matters like this, blacks negotiate from a position of weakness because they own no networks and few television stations. In the case of the complaint, in the case of the complaint, the NAACP would have come closer to addressing the core of the black problem if it had challenged the Federal Communications Commission and the executive branch of government to demand greater black ownership of television outlets. Without ownership, blacks are unable to communicate with their own people without passing through and having the approval of non-black media owners. And since black issues tend to make whites feel guilty or threatened, white media only gives blacks access to their media when the issues are race neutral or relevant to the majority society. Even when blacks own media, they have impediments to programming and economic success. The few broadcast and print properties that are black owned are so dependent upon white advertisers for revenue that programming from a black perspective is often muted to avoid disapproval as too black. Anything that is all black is too black. There are not enough black advertisers to support black media companies, which are an afterthought with white advertisers. If they do elect to purchase advertising from black-owned media outlets, it will be safe programming. They avoid supporting black media when it reflects racial controversy. No other group has such social prohibitions. Nearly 99% of all white Americans live in all white communities, work in all white offices, conduct businesses with white customers, and send their children to all white schools. White print and broadcast media outlets target nearly 100% white audiences, but they are not criticized for being too white. Even national political parties spend less with black media than they spend to reach other groups. According to the May 18th through May 24th, 2000 issue of the Challenger magazine, the Republican National Committee indicated it would spend $10 million in advertising with Hispanic media and $0 with black media in its 2000 presidential campaign. As late as 2 months before the polls opened, unofficial reports indicated that the National Democratic Party had yet to commit money to black media. White media monopolies go unchallenged, regardless of how frequently and unjustly black people are treated. The control of images we see by media and the corporations who buy advertising was demonstrated in Detroit, Michigan at the premiere showing of The Tulsa, Oklahoma Massacre, The Hidden Story in spring 2000. The movie produced for Home Box Office tells the story of the 1921 racial assault that claimed the lives of approximately 600 blacks. Their homes and businesses were robbed, bombed, and burned by whites who admitted in the program that they were jealous of black people's economic successes. Although this film is a poignant and important historical documentary, white businesses in the Detroit area refused to financially support its airing on the Wayne State University campus. Government resources have always been used to develop and maintain majority monopolies. Government policies allow media and communication monopolies, such as the telephone and broadcast industries. The internet, developed largely with government funds, is now owned by private companies and is becoming another white-owned media monopoly. Political and judicial monopolies. Let me see if I can put this up here. Maybe not. The nation's political and judicial systems are racial monopolies that form the superstructure of our society. The monopolies make nearly every political and legal issue about race a foregone conclusion. Politics and the court system tend to be more anti-black than the larger society. Legal justice has come to mean ensuring that blacks do not break the law while forcing them to cheerfully submit to whites breaking the law. Though their population monopolies ensure that whites will always dominate and rule, racism within the political and legal systems guarantee blacks will rarely win. Thurgood Marshall, by his acts and admissions, was probably the only U.S. Supreme Court justice prejudiced in favor of black people. However, outnumbered 8-1, his legal opinions had little real impact on race rulings. Conversely, Marshall's replacement on the U.S. Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, seems most concerned about his acceptance by white society. In fairness to Clarence Thomas, even if he were to begin acting as a responsible black man, his vote would not change the way the U.S. Supreme Court works and rules. He too was outnumbered. Several justices were appointed when there were two limit tests for any appointment to the Supreme Court: credible conservative views and willingness to avoid using the court to correct historical injustices, especially those committed against blacks. Michael Lind, in his book Up From Conservatism, shares a story that illustrates how bias against blacks is institutionalized in the judicial monopoly. Lind says, William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was ordered away from a polling place in Arizona in the 1950s because he was demanding that black voters be forced to prove they could read by reading the Constitution before being allowed to mark their ballots. Rehnquist passed the limit test of President Reagan, who appointed him, along with his racial attitudes, Chief Justice of the highest court in the nation. In this position, his racial bias could affect court decisions throughout the nation. Any counter-bias for blacks was nullified with Thomas's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. Consequently, judicial monopolies control the fate of blacks in ways that are rarely beneficial. Research supports this premise. As late as the 1990s, nearly 60% of whites, Hispanics, and Asian Americans continued to perceive black people as inferior, undeserving of justice, and innately criminal. Justice for blacks in a system that reflects such bias and indifference is virtually impossible. Whites maintain a monopoly on holding political office whether blacks vote or not. For example, increases in black voter registration and participation resulted in a 9,000% increase in the number of black elected officials within the last 2 generations. Yet, black public office holders still represent less than 1% of this nation's elected officials. The political and judicial systems are cornerstone institutions that whites monopolize, even as most people espouse belief in the colorblind myth. A monopoly on the elective and appointment process for public office will continue to place white males in control of 99% of all levels of government and legal systems. Whites in positions of power and authority have been conditioned by their experiences in American society to protect the status quo and the advantages of their own group's self-interest. They instinctively reflect the mores of structural racism in the normal course of behavior. The majority of whites who hold high positions in the political and judicial systems are descendants of white immigrants who entered this nation centuries after the ancestors of black Americans. Though their ancestors were not in this country when blacks were enslaved and segregated, special admission status reserved seats of power for them in the judicial and political systems. This nation's fundamental democratic values of inalienable rights and principles of fair play have yet to apply fully to blacks. There is no credible evidence that whites understand the true nature of racism and its monopolies or are concerned about the negative impact of them on the life chances of blacks. Whiteness as a monopoly is a subconscious construct that promotes aversion to any form of blackness, especially within the political legal system. Whites tend to equate blackness to liberalism, which has the effect of moving all the nation's political parties to racial selfishness. They stack the law enforcement and court systems with conservative officers and judges who are predisposed to anti-black feelings. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was enacted solely for the equal protection of blacks, is co-opted and used by the political system to maintain white dominance. By the virtue of black people's inherited disadvantages and whites' inherited life advantages, the races are locked into conflict and competition. These racial conflicts and the accompanying racial disparities cannot be eliminated by indifference or black leaders' accommodation. When black leaders accommodate and compromise, they lose respect and the black masses move no closer to the corridors of power and wealth. Moreover, whites find it easier to pacify blacks with symbolic rather than substantive political benefits and opportunities. This only further reinforces racial inequities. The implication of monopolies. The advantages that flow to white society from various monopolies, the visible manifestations of racism, have yet to be weighted and analyzed to determine how they handicap and injure black Americans in a competitive society. White monopolies guarantee white winners as if ordained by the gods. Few see their societal dominance as a persistent and fundamental injustice within American society. Racial monopolies adversely affect the welfare of blacks and further the best interests of the majority society. Within any marketplace, the majority society forces black competitors out of existence. This country's founders created a flawed social and political structure that only began to take on the appearance of a social democracy through the pain and suffering of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Black Civil Rights Movement. These national events, more symbolic rather than substantive for blacks, and now the likelihood of ever catching up with the majority white population is extremely remote. Blacks suffer too many wealth and resource power deficiencies. After nearly 4 centuries, 400 years, of trying to climb a greased pole, many blacks have given up hope of ever closing the inequality gaps. Structural racism and its monopolies have boxed and locked black people. But nothing created or constructed by mankind is perfect, including structural racism and racial monopolies. Myths of colorblind, race-neutral societies support racial monopolies. Public policies or programs that claim to be race-neutral or colorblind will not help black Americans, but support the status quo and prevailing inequalities. The dominant society uses its accumulated advantages to foster and provide even greater advantages for its members. However, with proper planning and preparation, Black America can compete and in some instances beat a monopoly. Let's look at 3 possible options that an oppressed group might use against the tyranny of a majority monopoly. The oppressed group can 1. Revolt and engage in civil disobedience that brings about political and economic reform or an entirely new government. 2. Petition government to intervene on its behalf and force a white monopoly to divest itself of some of the wealth, resources, and power. 3. Construct alternative political and economic systems and monopolies based on its own group advantages within its own communities. The suggestions in this book include all the options, but draw most heavily from numbers 2 and 3. With carefully planned behavioral changes, blacks can compete and in some instances beat monopolies. The second impediment to the empowerment of Black America is just as prohibitive. Prohibitive is the first impediment. The second impediment, inappropriate behavior patterns. The conditions of Black Americans cannot totally be blamed on white society's structural monopolies. The second impediment to empowering Black America is inappropriate behavior among members of its group. Their inappropriate behavior patterns stem from distorted vision. They are conditioned to be colorblind. They neither see nor want to be black. Blackness is not just skin color. It is more so an appropriate behavior pattern based upon a rational perspective, a perspective born out of a group's experiences and continuing dilemma. An erroneous perspective causes inappropriate behavior patterns. These behavior patterns de-empower rather than empower black people. In a society based on white superiority, it is inappropriate behavior when black people participate in their own subordination and exploitation. It is inappropriate behavior when their actions support the society when their actions support the established racial hierarchy and encourage dependency on white society. The more a minority group, especially a planned black minority for the group members to the sorry. The more a minority group, especially a planned black minority, becomes dependent on the majority white society, the harder it is for the group members to differentiate who they are and behave in their own best interests. Their dependency distorts racial reality and causes many of them to live in a state of denial, tolerating and justifying why they are in an oppressed state. They are generally willing to accept their poor quality of life and avoid any form of competitiveness unless it is against members of their own group. Categories of inappropriate behavior. There are many types of inappropriate behavior ranging from the classic sample. A sample was a black person who betrays his own race and gains personal profit, to a militant with an attitude of blacker than thou arrogance. Inappropriate behavior is the manifestation of the intentional softening of the competitive impulse in an individual or group to the point that everything is turned upside down and backwards. The individual or group is inclined to compete amongst themselves and ally with outsiders rather than allying with members of their own group to compete against outsiders. What is even more troublesome is that inappropriate behavior teaches whites and others how to treat black people. If black Americans want to change how they are treated, they must change what they are teaching their competitors. Below, we will briefly discuss a few of the most common and destructive categories of inappropriate behavior. Collusion with the competition. This type of behavior is visible in coalition building. It is without a doubt the most troubling for the race because it is a strategy used by so many members of Black America's leadership class. Although coalition building is a popular concept, coalitions almost always operate at the expense of Black Americans. Even though blacks themselves are not organized and do not have stated group goals, coalition building encourages them to coalesce with other groups that do have articulated goals rather than to organize their own group. Black participation gives credibility and strength to ethnic, class, gender, disabled, and Spanish-speaking groups, some of whom compete openly with blacks for wealth and power and openly oppose black gains. When blacks participate in coalitions, they allow the unique status, history, and debt owed to blacks to spread to all of the subgroups. Race is made synonymous with minority, and racism synonymous with any form of discrimination. These are gigantic distortions of reality and give fictional common ground for building coalitions between blacks and any group that perceives itself as aggrieved. Blacks should not be against any group, but what political or economic benefits do they derive from coalitions with Asians, American Indians, Hispanics, women, or gays that take black problems, convert them into minority problems, then propose non-specific universal solutions? Political coalitions created under the broad, ambiguous concept of minorities, cultural diversity, and multiculturalism do not benefit blacks as a group. In collusion with the competition, coalitions give black Americans a trickle-down political experience. They get what is left after gender, ethnic, religious, disabled, and Spanish language groups in the coalition to receive what they want and need. Black Americans lose by default due to the inappropriate behavior of the black leaders who choose cross-group alliances, white approval, and corporate dollars at the expense of their own people. Mayor Brown. Social etiquette. Behavior patterns in this category appear to stem directly from the old social or southern social etiquette. Behavior patterns in this category appear to stem directly from the old social or southern racial etiquette. Though one of the major accomplishments of the black civil rights movement in the 1960s was to modify some of the social etiquette that traditionally existed between blacks and whites, many blacks across America, especially in the South and Midwest, continue to honor old social customs. They avoid situations that make them appear free, independent, and active in shaping their own lives. They are perfectly happy to go to work or to church, look at a television, and then go to bed. They still know their place and know how to play get low. To them, what happens to black people locally or anywhere else is of little concern. They want to appear as good Negroes, content, happy, compromising, and non-competitive. A good Negro or a safe black person seeks approval of whites. These blacks will neither speak up nor speak out on black issues, nor will they defend against black injustice. Avoiding blackness. Blacks who exhibit this behavior avoid association with any form of blackness. They want to be the first or only black person in an integrated company, school, neighborhood, organization, or political party. Like whites, many blacks gauge the amount of black presence in anything that is not integrated or is all black, is too black, and politically incorrect. This phenomenon is so peculiar to blacks. There is no similar expression that someone or something is too Jewish, too Indian, too white, or too Asian. Avoiding blackness allows many to live in a state of denial until the reality roosters come home. A true story illustrates how blacks try to avoid blackness. A woman who had grown up in a conservative Midwestern town was proud of the respect and status whites accorded her family. She was proud that she and her children were economically better off than most blacks in town, and her husband was well known in white political circles. However, her world came tumbling down one day when she was in the grocery store with her young daughter. When leaving the store, they came face to face with the white mother and daughter. The young white child pulled on her mother's dress and said, "Look, mommy, there are some niggers." The white mother pulled the little girl close and whispered, "Hush, honey, those are Wilson niggers." The friend who related the story was the young black daughter. She said that for the first time in her life, she knew that regardless of her family's economic status or prominence, she was not allowed to escape her skin color. While blacks do not mind being identified with a particular sports team or political party, many reject being identified with the skin color team that God has assigned them. Avoiding blackness is a counter to the way Avoiding blackness is counter to the way outgroups respond. They exhibit an increased sense of group consciousness and close their ranks. They create associations, organizations, and businesses dedicated to whatever characteristics others dislike. For instance, if Jews are persecuted because of their religion, they protect and strengthen themselves by building Jewish businesses, organizations, and tight-knit communities. They build Jewish synagogues that teach Jewish culture, history, and religion. They help build and support the Jewish state of Israel. Women who feel marginalized by the system because of their gender respond by building women's organizations and businesses to promote women's issues. The gay community builds gay organizations, businesses, and tight-knit communities. Asians respond to this type of diversity by building businesses, organizations, and tight-knit communities around their Asian culture. When whites say they despise black people, blacks adopt that same attitude. They imitate whites and run from blackness, which should serve as a rallying point around which to build defenses. When blacks run away from themselves and avoid their own skin color, heritage, history, and other members of their race, they become vulnerable and defenseless. They cannot protect themselves. Wake up. I'm telling y'all, this is deep. And he kicking it too. White ice is colder. Another category of inappropriate behavior is the persistent belief that white ice is colder. Black America is conditioned by family, school, and all the social institutions to believe that whites are inherently superior. They not. Although there have always been blacks who tried to disabuse other blacks of this belief, their efforts have had limited effect. The superior quality of the white man's ice remains a commonly accepted belief and expression in Black America. I am a witness. In the mid-70s, I actually saw a real-life display of this inappropriate mindset and behavior. Standing with a friend in front of his office building in Tallahassee, Florida, I saw a black man drive up to a black-owned grocery store. He got out of his car and walked over to the ice machine. He picked up several bags of ice, examined them, put them back in the ice machine, then walked across the street to a white-owned liquor store. There, he went to the ice machine and took out 2 bags of ice. He examined them and then went to the drive-thru window to pay for them. My friend and I were so struck by the behavior that we asked him why he rejected the ice at the black store but purchased the identical brand from the white-owned store. He said, "I don't like Mr. Brown's ice. It's too lumpy. Jack's liquor ice is better." That day, I learned that not only was white ice colder, but apparently smoother to at least one black man. Inappropriate behavior has become deeply rooted in the psyche of Black America's dialectic type of reasoning. If whites touch it, make it, sell it, repair it, or talk about it, only when it's acceptable only when it's only then is it acceptable to blacks. But on an even deeper level, black inappropriate behavior seems to suggest that a significant number of blacks place more value on being alive than the conditions under which they live. Eradicating these self-depreciating habits and learned inappropriate behavior patterns begins with offering black people new information, new political and economic goals, new social psychological models, and new hope. The third impediment: no plan for empowerment. Through the years, blacks and whites alike have called for blacks to organize and help themselves rather than depending on whites. As early as the 1860s, Albion W. Torgey, a visionary abolitionist, prophesied that neither the enactment of laws nor appeals to the majority of society's conscience will reverse the tide of white racism or lift black people. Torgey believed that the solution to the nation's race problem rested in blacks becoming more independent, exhibiting greater militancy and self-assertion. Torgey was so committed to those beliefs that even as a white man, he fought the conservative philosophies of Booker T. Washington, a black man. Torgey tried to convince Washington that black Americans would never gain political and economic parity in America until they organized themselves to pursue a course toward economic justice. A century later, a national commitment to economic justice for blacks still has not been made. Social integration and civil rights remain the foremost issues. Black America needs a national plan and a knowledgeable, committed leadership to guide it toward group empowerment and economic justice. Powernomics is a national plan and requires institutional leadership to implement it. It is reverse social engineering. The sole purpose of Powernomics is to unleash the economic and political potential of Black America by addressing the historical, structural economic inequalities between the races and the self-defeating inappropriate behavior patterns of Black Americans by the year 2005. Now that the need for empowerment has been established, the remaining chapters and appendices of this book explain the Powernomics plan and how to achieve Black empowerment. Peace. That was a great read. We're going to be on chapter 2 tomorrow. Have a good evening. Peace.